Hello, this is Dr. Francis Yu, and today in this video, I'm going to be talking about The Good Place, the show that I finished watching on Netflix last week after it was recommended to me by my friend, Dr. Dhruv Amin. And he knows I'm a philosophy guy. I studied mathematics and philosophy in undergrad, and you see behind me, I like books, and definitely philosophy is one of those things that I find exciting and fulfilling and fun to read in my um, free time or whatever you want to call it. So, The Good Place, there are spoilers in this, and this review of The Good Place has really nothing to do with the plot itself or characters and things like that. I'm just more I just want to talk about the philosophy that's in it in this video. And there's another video in which I talk about the Enneagram uh, view of the characters of The Good Place. So the overall idea of the show is that there is an afterlife in which people go and retain their consciousness in their body after they died, and through various circumstances, the characters learn from one of the other dead characters, Chidi, who is a professor in ethics and moral philosophy. And along the way, to introduce a lot of different philosophers, philosophical ideas, in particular about ethics and moral philosophy. And I must say, they did a really good job in representing what each of the philosophical models say without really going into a lot of detail. Because the more you go into detail into any of these systems, the more exceptions or complications arise, and it's easier to mess up things. But I would say that they did a really great job in introducing what the concepts are about. And in a way, they're a teaser to learn more about them. There are typically, in the modern Western way of looking at ethics, three main schools of thought in which the show does go through descriptions of. And for to keep it simple, I will just showcase like the figureheads of each school, I suppose. So Chidi does talk about Aristotle, but let me come back to him. First, let's talk about Chidi's favorite, Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant, and his school is deontological ethics, and specifically Kant's theory is the categorical imperative, in which the goodness or badness of a specific decision is entirely wholly based on the inherent goodness or badness of that that action, behavior, decision. In essence, it's bad to do anything that's bad. So killing, lying, and if you follow his train of argument, Immanuel Kant argues that if you lie, that creates a world in which lying is feasible, such that the proper functioning of the world into human functioning isn't possible, because lying would then cause the falling of human interrelations. If murder were allowed, then people would just murder each other. So the idea in the deontological ethics, in particular Kant's categorical imperative, is that an action regardless of the consequences, has a moral value attributed to it strictly by its value given to its inherent value. Now, this is definitely at odds. Let's say you could come up with an example in which, let's say, lying makes, or not telling the truth exactly, would make someone feel better and comfort them in a time of, let's say, distress. And people may say that, and they may tell the truth, and really hard truth, in a moment in which it may be not exactly comforting. Then you can say, oh, that was wrong to do. But for Immanuel Kant, the truth, telling the truth, is utmost importance. And you can see this in Chidi as he talks about, I can't lie, I can't lie. And if he feels uncomfortable about lying. And although I would argue that rather than Chidi following the categorical imperative, is more that he has this complex, psychological complex of decision making, which is a big thing for him throughout the show, and that he just happens to rely on Immanuel Kant for his theory to almost buttress his actions and what he does. Now, this is in contrast with John Stuart Mill, Utilitarianism. I don't know where I put that book. Anyway, so John Stuart Mill, he's the figurehead of utilitarianism, which is a specific branch of consequentialism. So what is consequentialism? As exactly as it sounds, it's about the consequences. So the value of a outcome relies entirely on the consequences. There are various types of consequentialisms, but in particular, utilitarianism seeks to optimize utility, or quote unquote happiness. So, for example, if, let's say, you had two people that really loved ice cream, and you had, let's say, a quart of ice cream. You can give it the entire quart for one person to eat and not give any to the second person. The first person will be quite happy. And the second person will either be unhappy if they know this is happening, or neutral. Now, let's say the first person eats the entire quart and feels terrible afterwards. Then you have to argue, is the happiness from eating the ice cream greater than, let's say, the discomfort and bloating he may feel afterwards? Or you can split up the quart into two halves and give the half quart each to each person, so that each person can enjoy it and increase their happiness. Now, consequentialism and utilitarianism has a lot of, I'm giving a very superficial example, but you can always, not always, but it's easy to give these exceptions or twists to the example, which complicates things. For example, let's say these two people love ice cream, and they're both lactose intolerant, or just one is. Who do you give more ice cream to maximize their happiness? And let's say dairy isn't really the most healthy thing to eat. And then there's the thought of that. And how do you really calculate the values of happiness? And then it gets involved. On the superficial level, it seems simple, but it gets kind of complicated quite quickly. So the most extreme example would be, let's say so the trolley problem that shows up in the Good Show, the Good Place, it clearly defines the trolley problem, where there's a trolley and there is a choice where it's heading towards either a group of 5 people or a one person, because they're two sets of tracks. And the decision is to you have to run over the 5 or the 1. And with consequentialism, utilitarianism specifically, you would kill the 1 person to save the 5, because 5 lives saved would be numerically higher than saving the 1 person. Now, but then it gets that's obviously against Immanuel Kant's um, categorical imperative, where you shouldn't kill anyone at all. And then basically, if the trolley is heading towards the 5 people, you wouldn't change it to the 1 person, because your action would then lead to the death of this 1 person. And it's kind of nuanced and or silly, whichever way you want to look at it. But then these are the experiments, thought experiments that people do. So that there are philosophers who try to reconcile these two and come up with these systems, but essentially these two systems are more or less at odds with each other from a face value. Now, going back to Aristotle now, his ethical system falls onto the virtue ethics school, where it's not particularly about the results of the actions, nor the morality of the actions themselves. Here, the ethics and morality has to do with the character of the person doing those actions. Meaning, does this person have character? And does this person's actions, are they virtuous? And he has these lists of virtues and vices, and it's quite interesting, but I'm not going to go into the full details here. So here the focus is now, I would say, more so on the person deciding, and the person deciding, choosing, and acting, versus consequentialism, utilitarianism, and deontological ethics, Kant's categorical imperative, focuses a little bit more on the action itself, I would say. So those 3 schools are represented quite well, at least described quite well on the show, although it does tend to focus more on Immanuel Kant, because it's just Chidi's selection, and I think it fits his character more. And it does mention the utilitarianism, because the trolley problem episode, it does that pretty well. Oh, it does go into the trolley problem very specifically to which kind of pits the deontological ethics and the utilitarianism against each other, and with very, very interesting variations and such. I thought that was a very, very good episode that really discussed it quite well. All right, and later at the more end of the show of the I forget, yeah, season 4, or it's either the end of season 3 or beginning of season 4, where Chidi realizes the metaphysics of it all, meaning how everything actually works, that he is doomed to go to the bad place no matter what he does under the current system. And then he adapts this nihilistic approach, which, if you had to categorize it under an ethical system, it's loosely, I would say, it's a lack or non-existence of a ethical system, because there's no meaning to anything at all. So anything and everything is permissible, because there's no meaning, and everything's gonna die, and we're gonna die, and everything's gonna come to existence. There's no point to it all. This is that part where he's making a chili in class, and then it gets all dramatic and very moody and despondent about a situation. Now, the most interesting ethical considerations really comes up in the end of season 4, in which now all the main characters are in the real good place. And they find that everyone is zombied out, because they have eternal quote unquote happiness and can do whatever they want, and there's eternal pleasure, you could say. So in a way, you could say, from utilitarian perspective, there's no bad consequences under that rubric. And perhaps even the categorical imperative, the ontological ethical system, there is no bad thing that can happen or be decided or done, because everything just adds to the pleasure. People can have whatever they want. But this leads to ironically or fittingly, a total non-existence of an ethical system, because there is no wish, there's no desire. And I don't know if this was their they intended this, but that by not having a desire, not having a drive, not having things that are wanted, it leads to a system in which uh, ethics are almost unimportant, and not the nihilistic way, actually kind of nihilistic way, because there's no point to it all. Not because everything's going to die and be non-existent, but because everyone will live forever and not find, uh, and the pleasure will be forever, and you get tired of the pleasure. And so it's almost like a reverse nihilism. And interestingly, then they change the good place so that you can essentially die in the good place. They don't go into it much detail, which I think they did on purpose. But essentially, you can walk through this. I don't know what to call it. Go to the forest, and there's this place where if you walk through it, you more or less die, or your ego ceases to exist, and they call it returning back to the universe. And essentially, what they did, and what Eleanor says, in the end of season 4, this pretty much explains existentialism, where there is a ultimate death now, because now you can die or cease to, you can choose to leave the afterlife in a way, which makes then living in the good place in the afterlife not eternal if you choose it not to be. Here, now the good place, they have everything they want, they can foster the relationship, and not to say that the characters are not uh, from a utilitarian or deontological or maybe even virtue ethics all good per se, but they have contributed in a way in which now the new system says, okay, now they can go to the good place. But I would say this introduction of, in other words, I think, I don't know if this is what they intended, but for me, now this good place, this land of this world of opportunity, possible happiness, contribution, pleasure, and all these things really is a reflection of the life we have now, meaning right now, as you listen to this, you're alive, and I'm probably alive as you're listening to me. This is recorded. Is that the opportunity for such happiness, pleasure, contribution, and relationships for life happens now. But as in the show, only because there is death, the opportunity for non-existence, that there is meaning and value in the living of the now. Now, this is essentially a crux of existentialism. So, father of existentialism is Danish writer Søren Kierkegaard, and one of my top guys and mentors and people I look up to. And along the same vein, in that school, we have people like Friedrich Nietzsche, Martin Heidegger, Jean-Paul Sartre, who roughly fit into this school of existentialism, although it wasn't really until Jean-Paul Sartre where people can say, oh, I'm an existentialist or not. It's not as if Søren Kierkegaard said, hey, I'm introducing existentialism. It's just a kind of a label he was given afterwards. So here, really, it has to do with similar to nihilism, in which there's an end, a sort of finitude of the realization of now. But in existentialism, that gives birth to a valuation and meaning, because there is an end or a perceived end to the living now. And that's why Eleanor, when she's thinking, why don't I feel like I can leave the good place, she realized she has things to do. And this is not quite an ethical system. It's more of it's a completely different framework altogether, where it's all about the subjectivity. Now, if we have to call the most objective ethical system, that would be both the categorical imperative, the ontology, and the consequentialism, utilitarianism, the very objective sort of ethics. And virtue ethics kind of falls in between, I would say, and you could relate a lot of it to existentialism, but nihilism is kind of like it's nothing matters anyway, so there is no system. But existentialism essentially is a subjective, intrapersonal value and meaning that only comes from the depths of oneself and relation to the finitude and the endness. So, let me find this book. Chidi does occasionally refer to Eastern philosophy, but doesn't really go into the ethics as much. But he does, in the end, describe dying from the good place as a wave returning back to the ocean. And it's a Zen Buddhist, and he says, like I don't know, was it Zen Buddhist? Some sort of Buddhist philosophy about the metaphysics or the identity of human beings. And what I find good and bad is that they finally talked a little bit about kind of the Eastern philosophy of ethics. But what Eastern philosophy of ethics really introduces is the idea that the morality of something, the ethics of something, is not separable from the metaphysics of what really exists, what is real eternally or not real eternally, and epistemology. What can we know about what is true and what is not? And it really drives the point home where it's not really about good and bad in a lot of, I would say, a large portion of the Eastern philosophies is not too consumed with the goodness and badness of things. And whether it's Indian philosophy, spirituality, like through the Upanishads or Taoism, through like Taoism, and there's not really, well, there is Buddhist text, but there's a lot of those things. I mean, the canon is very interesting, the story with that, but let's say I just have this book, Zen Koans, okay, where the function of it, as Chidi says, is more about what is my relationship to the whole and the whole's relationship to myself. And really the concept is, what is the identity and what is the self, or is there a self? And then that really answers any ethical questions, or maybe even deletes the need for ethical questions, or doesn't make it even a question about ethics anymore. It's rather about, because in Taoism we'll be going with the flow. Am I going from point A to point B in a way that's positive? Well, not positive is not the best word. It's very flowing and it's not harmful and interrupting of the flow. So it would be nice. It would have been nice if they talked a little bit more about the Eastern ethics of it, ethics of Eastern philosophies and such. And the only other thing that I thought was missing, or they should have, I think, put more in about, was how the metaphysics, epistemology of religions of the modern Western world, how that fit into the ethical systems there. And I thought it was interesting how they very conveniently, probably because it was easier, they just didn't have any religious overtones or mention of anything religious, or besides the terms like demons and things like that, but no specific religious system, except for if you consider Taoism and Buddhism religiosity, then yes, that was there, but no Western mention of Western religious systems. So as you can tell, I'm very excited, and I had a lot to say. But this was really just the overview and my perception of what was good about The Good Place. And number one, I was happy that it really portrayed different systems quite well. The trolley problem chapter episode was really good. And you could just talk about that and talk about a whole lot of stuff for a while. And it really ended on an existentialist theme, which is really my mode of being. I'm like the existential explorer, and it's something that I feel home with. Talking about existentialism, that's my outlook on life and such. So, if this encourages you to watch the show, great. That wasn't really the incentive, but maybe now you can watch it under this philosophical rubric. Number two, if it encourages you to talk about philosophy and read and go a little bit deeper into your mind and ethics and all that, that's great too. But really, just wanted to share my experience with this show. I think it aired somewhere else first, but it was on Netflix. So thank you to Dhruv for recommending the show to me, and I guess this video is dedicated to you. And if you like to subscribe and keep in touch and see all the other videos I talk about in general, my philosophy, psychology, practicalities for profound progress, musings, thoughts. In particular, I'm going to start doing more of these reviews of psychological, philosophical views of popular or unpopular, it doesn't matter, TV shows and movies and such, and to see how things like the Myers-Briggs, Enneagram, Jungian psychology, philosophical systems kind of plays out, and how we can learn about ourselves by watching these shows with a different perspective. So subscribe, and I'll catch you later.